The new show that's opened up at the Whitechapel Gallery is well worth a visit. It's a group show called Life is More Important Than Art. That's Why Art is Important. And in the gallery guide, it describes the purpose of the exhibition as exploring the intersection of art and everyday life and the role of contemporary art institution at a time of uncertainty and change. I never really like these explanations. They always seem really forced. I'm not really sure I could do better, but I think I prefer untitled. But it is a show that feels like it has a strong coherence and there is a theme here. So the title is probably this description is probably as good as any. The common theme that I picked up and that I really enjoyed and related to was that a lot of the art was focused on the everyday, on the mundane. And these are qualities that I like to have in my own work. So I always respond really positively to seeing that in other people's work. As I say, it's a group show and there's quite a lot of different work here. And it's well worth seeing it all. But I just pick out some of the works that really stood out for me. In the first room, there's an installation by Osman Yousefzadeh called An Immigrant's Room of Her Own. And it's an installation of a bedroom, and it contains many household objects vacuum wrapped in black plastic, and there's a chest of drawers with soil in, and there's plaited hair coming off the chest of drawers, and this kind of makes a boundary that we can't cross into the work. It does feel like you're stepping into a world that's telling a story. It feels like it's saying a lot with many layers. Interestingly, I had the feeling that it was by a female artist as I was looking at the work, and I found out afterwards reading the literature that he's male. But of course the work is about his mother, so there is a female element to the work. The second work that really grabbed me was a work called Film Stills by Mitra Tabrizian. And these are stills from her film column, which I hadn't heard of, but I have since watched and very much enjoyed. The photos in the exhibition they're not normal stills, they're empty scenes from the film. And I really relate to these stills, to these photos, in the way I try and produce work. These are beautifully composed shots of rundown places, and I really love that. They look good aesthetically, and they're really peaceful places, even though it's clear that they may not be in the best part of town. There's two works here by John Smith. First, The Girl with the Chewing Gum from 1976, and I already knew this work, and I find this a really compelling work. It's almost like found footage. This is the mundane, and it's just a film of people walking to and fro along the street, but a director giving instructions as if he is actually controlling what's going on in the street. And it gets very interesting because at some point it goes slightly out of sync, and it turns out the director's actually in a field in a different location. It's a really quirky work, and I've always really liked it. So I was pleased to see it in this show. The big shame for me is that it's on a small TV with headphones, which is how I can watch it at home. Actually, it's screening on Mubi in the UK, so it's easy to see on a small TV. But I would have loved to see this on a big screen with the sound in the gallery. That would be my only criticism. The other work by John Smith is Citadel, which was made during the pandemic and shot wholly from his flat. And this is shown in a dedicated room on a screen with sound. And it did work really well. It's a really interesting piece. There's kind of two parts to it. The first part is that we keep seeing the same view of the city of London, but at all different times and light and weather. And in this way, it reminded me of Helena Parmenson, who I talked about in my review of Godland, who uses this technique of shooting the same view in many different times. And the second part of this Smith work was just shots of the houses around where he lived in the dark with lights going on and off. Aesthetically, it's really interesting seeing these rectangles appearing and disappearing. It's very compelling watching all the lights going on and off. And alongside this work, there are clips from Boris Johnson's speeches, which do make it explicitly a political piece, which sometimes such explicit politics I slightly balk at, but I think in this it works. It is about capitalism and corporate power, but I think its most exciting element is it's the aesthetics of it. It's a great film to look at. When you go upstairs in the gallery, there's a work by Raina Begum called Number 1272 Chain Link. And this is I just thought this gave a really interesting kind of effect when you looked through it. It's effectively 2D chain link, but layered as it is, when you look through it and move, it almost becomes like 3D shapes, like a 3D model of molecules. And it was just a really interesting effect. There's an excellent work by Susan Hiller called the J Street Project Index, where she mapped every German street that had the word Juden or Jew in the name. And the exhibit is 303 colour photographs and then a map of where all these streets are located in Germany. And it's a really powerful piece. I think this is a really excellent piece, kind of making this quite poetic and beautiful work, but obviously with something so traumatic underlying it. I have to say, though, that this work was completely ruined by the religious choral music that was bleeding into this room from the Mark Wallinger work, which was 2 rooms away. And it really changes the piece. The sad, melancholic music, obviously it fits with the photos given the subject matter. But the work really speaks for itself. If you were to actually include such music with the work, it would be far too obvious and too manipulative. And it's such a shame because it completely ruins the work. The gallery must be aware. I mean, I don't know if they like the fact that it bleeds into it, but for me, this is just such a big mistake. The next room is a film by Sarah Dobai, and this has exactly the same problem as the Hiller piece, because obviously it's 1 room closer, so it's got sound coming from the next room. We watched that film with headphones on, but we can actually still hear the music. Now, at that point, I didn't know the music was from the Wallinger piece. So you don't know if you can hear the music above the sound in the headphones. And I thought this was potentially quite interesting, how the music almost went with the film. And so you had these 2 soundtracks, the external one and the one in the headphones. But of course, it wasn't actually to do with the work. So again, it's really problematic that the work in the different room is affecting Dobai's work, and I thought this was really unfortunate. I didn't really connect with this film. I didn't really connect with the story in the Dobai film. It's a racist attack on a young boy, and there's explicit parallels to Oh Hazar Balthazar, which is a Bresson film that I absolutely love. The references are very clear and they're not just implied, they're really explicit, and it kind of had some interest. And what I did like about this film was the way text was used. It was used in an almost video essay style, or the way that text is used in an indie computer game where characters speak according to the decisions that you make. So I think this work did have some merits, apart from it being so affected by the sound from the next room. So the Mark Wallinger work is the last work. It's called Threshold to the Kingdom. And it's a slow motion film of people arriving in an airport with a soundtrack of religious choral music. And I do think that watching people come through the arrivals door is really interesting. I've actually, when I've been picking up, I've always found that an interesting thing to watch. And I've actually have thought previously of how cinematic and theatrical it is when you watch people arriving and people greeting them as they meet them. He captures this to some extent, I think, and it is, I did like the piece. The film is in slow motion, so you become aware of every movement of really small gestures. It's a really simple piece, but it works quite well. Overall, for a group show with very different works, there is a coherence here and a kind of some themes that run through. There's some really interesting work here, and it's definitely worth a visit.